The dust from the stagecoach hadn't even settled when Alina Wilson stepped down onto the main street of Empire City, Colorado, her hand trembling as she gripped the door frame, and somewhere in the crowd of curious onlookers, a cowboy named Grant Jackson watched her arrival with a mixture of dread and something uncomfortably close to fascination. Grant had been avoiding this moment for 3 weeks, ever since his mother had announced her decision with the finality of a judge's gavel. Martha Jackson had chosen Alina Wilson, a young woman from Philadelphia, to be her son's bride. The arrangements had been made through letters, through an agency that specialized in matching Eastern women with Western men, though Grant himself had never written a single word to the woman now standing in the Colorado sunshine looking pale and uncertain. That her? His ranch hand, Pete, asked from beside him. That's her, Grant confirmed, his voice flat. He couldn't bring himself to move forward to claim this stranger his mother had selected like picking out cattle at auction. Alina's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a face she'd only seen in a photograph, a stern image of a man who looked nothing like the person she'd imagined during the long journey west. She clutched her carpetbag tighter, suddenly aware of how out of place her Philadelphia dress looked among the practical cotton and leather of the frontier town. The corset beneath her traveling suit felt impossibly tight, and the September heat of 1882 Colorado was nothing like the crisp autumn she'd left behind. Martha Jackson pushed through the crowd before Grant could force himself forward. She was a formidable woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her skin. "Miss Wilson," she called out, her voice carrying across the dusty street. "Welcome to Empire City." Alina turned toward the voice, relief flooding through her at having anyone, acknowledge her presence. "Mrs. Jackson," the same. "Come, come, let's get you out of this heat." Martha took Alina's arm with surprising gentleness, guiding her toward a waiting wagon. "Grant will collect your trunk." Grant, finally, he had no choice. Grant stepped forward, removing his hat as he approached the two women. Up close, Alina was younger than he'd expected, maybe 22 or 23, with light brown hair that caught copper in the sunlight and gray eyes that held a mixture of hope and fear. She was pretty, he supposed, in a delicate Eastern way that seemed ill-suited to the harsh realities of ranch life. "Madam," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Mr. Jackson." Alina offered her hand, and he shook it briefly, noting how small and soft it felt against his calloused palm. The ride to the Jackson Ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Martha filled the quiet with a running commentary on the passing landscape, pointing out neighboring properties and sharing gossip about people Alina didn't know. Grant drove the wagon, his attention fixed on the road, answering his mother's occasional questions with single syllables. Alina sat between them, acutely aware of Grant's presence, the way his forearms flexed as he handled the reins, the set of his jaw beneath several days' worth of stubble. He was handsome in a weathered way, probably around 28 or 29, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of strong coffee. But there was a coldness in those eyes when they briefly met hers, a resentment that made her stomach clench with anxiety. The Jackson Ranch sprawled across a valley between two ridges, with a main house built of logs and stone, several outbuildings and corrals that held more horses than Alina had ever seen in one place. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that both thrilled and terrified her. "I'll show you to your room," Martha said, as Grant lifted Alina's trunk from the wagon with ease. "We'll have supper in an hour. That will give you time to freshen up and rest from your journey." The room Martha led her to was simple but clean, with a bed covered in a handmade quilt, a dresser, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that looked out over the valley. It was worlds away from her bedroom in Philadelphia, but Alina found herself grateful for the privacy, the moment to collect herself before facing whatever came next. She washed the travel dust from her face and hands, changed into a fresh dress, and sat on the edge of the bed, fighting back tears. What had she done? She'd agreed to marry a stranger, to leave everything familiar behind, because her father had died leaving debts that consumed everything, and her stepmother had made it clear there was no place for her in the remarried household. The agency had promised security, a fresh start, a chance at building a life. But they hadn't mentioned the cold-eyed cowboy who clearly wanted nothing to do with her, or the domineering mother who had selected her like choosing fabric at a dry goods store. A knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Miss Wilson," it was Martha's voice. "Supper's ready." The dining room was dominated by a large table that could seat a dozen people, though only 3 places were set. Grant stood when Alina entered, a gesture of politeness that seemed at odds with the way he avoided meeting her eyes. The meal was simple but well prepared: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. Martha kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking Alina questions about her journey, her life in Philadelphia, her education. "I understand you worked as a teacher," Martha said, passing the bread basket. "Yes, madam, at a school for girls. I taught literature and music." Alina's voice was quiet but steady. "Music," Martha sniffed. "Well, that's not much use on a ranch, but I suppose you can learn practical skills. Can you sew, cook, manage a household?" "I can sew and I know the basics of cooking, though I'll admit I have much to learn about managing a household of this size." Alina forced herself to meet Martha's gaze. "But I'm willing to learn, Mrs. Jackson. I'm not afraid of hard work." For the first time, Grant spoke beyond monosyllables. "Teaching school is hard work. Different kind, maybe, but hard all the same." Both women looked at him in surprise. He seemed surprised himself, as if the words had escaped without permission. He focused intently on his stew, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "Be that as it may," Martha continued, "ranch life requires specific skills. We'll start your instruction tomorrow. The wedding is planned for Saturday, which gives us 5 days to prepare you properly." Alina's spoon clattered against her bowl. "Saturday? But that's so soon," I thought. "I mean, shouldn't we have time to become acquainted first?" "You'll have a lifetime to become acquainted," Martha said firmly. "The arrangements are made, the reverend has been notified. There's no sense in delay." Grant stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to check on the horses." He left without another word, the door closing firmly behind him. Martha sighed. "You'll have to forgive my son, Miss Wilson. He's set in his ways, not accustomed to change. But he's a good man, a hard worker, and he'll provide well for you." "That's more than many women can say of their husbands." "I'm sure you're right, Mrs. Jackson." Alina pushed her stew around her bowl, her appetite gone. "If you'll excuse me, I'm very tired from my journey. Would it be all right if I retired for the evening, of course?" "We rise early here before dawn. I'll wake you at 5. In her room, Alina finally let the tears fall. She'd made a terrible mistake. Grant Jackson didn't want her, might never want her, and she was trapped in an arrangement his mother had orchestrated without his consent. It was worse than she'd imagined, worse than being alone in Philadelphia, because at least there she had her dignity. Here, she was an unwanted burden, a problem to be managed. Outside, Grant stood in the barn, his forehead pressed against his horse's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and leather and animal warmth. He was furious with his mother for putting him in this position, for choosing a wife for him as if he were still a child incapable of making his own decisions. He was angry with himself for being too much of a coward to refuse, to stand up and say no. This wasn't what he wanted. But underneath, the anger was something else, something he didn't want to acknowledge. The way Alina had looked when his mother had announced the wedding date, the flash of panic in those gray eyes before she'd carefully smoothed her expression into compliance. The quiet dignity with which she'd admitted she had much to learn. The tremor in her hands when she'd shaken his. She hadn't chosen this either, he realized. She was as trapped as he was, maybe more so. At least he was on familiar ground, surrounded by people and places he knew. She traveled halfway across the country to marry a stranger who couldn't even bring himself to look at her properly. "You're a bastard, Jackson," he muttered to himself. "Talking to yourself now." Pete appeared in the barn doorway. "That's never a good sign. She's here." Grant straightened, running a hand through his hair. "I saw, pretty girl, you could do worse." "I didn't do anything. Ma did. She arranged the whole damn thing without asking if it's what I wanted." Pete leaned against a post, studying his friend. "And what do you want?" It was a fair question. Grant was 29 years old, and he'd been alone since Sarah had died 4 years ago. Sarah, his childhood sweetheart, his first love, his wife of barely 18 months before fever had taken her. He'd sworn after her death that he'd never marry again, that he couldn't survive that kind of loss twice. His mother had respected his grief for 3 years before she'd apparently decided enough was enough and taken matters into her own hands. "I want to be left alone," Grant said finally. "That's not living, that's just existing, and your ma knows it." Pete pushed off from the post. "Give the girl a chance, Grant. It's not her fault your mother's a force of nature, and it's not fair to punish her for not being Sarah." The words hit harder than Pete probably intended. Grant watched his friend leave, then looked up at the house, where a single lamp burned in the window of the guest room. Alina's room. In 5 days, she'd be his wife, whether he was ready or not. Sleep didn't come easily for either of them that night. Martha was true to her word, waking Alina before dawn with a brisk knock on the door. The next 5 days passed in a blur of activity. Martha taught Alina to cook on the massive cast iron stove, to churn butter, to preserve vegetables, to mend work clothes with stitches strong enough to withstand hard use. Alina's soft hands developed blisters that broke and bled and gradually toughened into calluses. Her back ached from bending over the washtub, her arms burned from carrying heavy buckets of water from the well. But she didn't complain. She set her jaw and learned, absorbing every instruction, every correction, every rare word of approval. Martha was a demanding teacher, but Alina sensed that beneath the sternness was a kind of grudging respect for her willingness to try. Grant watched from a distance, catching glimpses of Alina as she worked. Hanging laundry on the line, her face pink from the heat of the stove. Gathering eggs from the henhouse, talking softly to the chickens. Sitting on the porch in the evening mending his shirts by lamplight, her head bent in concentration. Each time he saw her, something tight in his chest loosened a fraction. On Wednesday, he found her in the barn, staring at the horses with an expression of longing. She didn't notice him at first, and he took the opportunity to observe her unguarded. She looked tired, he thought. The delicate skin under her eyes was shadowed with exhaustion, and her dress hung a little looser than it had when she'd arrived. "You like horses?" He spoke quietly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, surprise flickering across her face before she composed herself. "I don't know much about them, but they're beautiful. We had a carriage horse in Philadelphia, but I never learned to ride." Grant considered for a moment, then made a decision that surprised him. "Would you like to learn, truly?" Hope lit her eyes, making her look younger, less burdened. "Come on." He led her to a stall where a gentle mare named Daisy stood munching hay. "This is Daisy. She's about the calmest horse we have, perfect for a beginner." For the next hour, Grant taught Alina the basics of approaching a horse, how to let Daisy smell her hand, how to stroke her neck and shoulder. He showed her how to brush the mare's coat, his hands covering Alina's to demonstrate the proper technique. It was the first time they'd really touched since that initial handshake, and Grant was acutely aware of the warmth of her skin, the faint scent of lavender soap. Alina was a quick study, patient with the mare, soft-spoken and gentle. Daisy responded to her immediately, nuzzling her shoulder in search of treats. "She likes you," Grant said, and there might have been a hint of a smile in his voice. "I like her too." Alina smiled at the horse, a genuine expression of pleasure that transformed her face. For a moment, Grant forgot to breathe. "Tomorrow, if you want, we could try getting you up on her, just walking around the corral." "I'd like that very much, Mr. Jackson. Thank you. You could call me Grant, since we're—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Since we're to be married on Saturday." Alina said it for him, her voice steady despite the color that rose in her cheeks. "All right then, Grant, and you should call me Alina." "Alina." He said her name for the first time, tasting it on his tongue. "It suits you." Martha's voice called from the house, breaking the moment. Alina handed him the brush, their fingers briefly touching. "I should go. Thank you again. For this. It means more than you might think." She left quickly, and Grant stood in the barn holding the brush, staring after her. What was he doing? He'd promised himself he wouldn't get attached, wouldn't let this stranger into his heart. But standing in the barn teaching her about horses had felt natural, easy, like something he'd been meant to do. Thursday brought rain, a steady downpour that turned the yard to mud and kept everyone indoors. Alina helped Martha with indoor chores, learning to card wool and work the spinning wheel. Grant worked on tack in the barn, repairing bridles and oiling leather, but his mind kept wandering to the house, wondering what Alina was doing. That evening, after supper, Martha announced she was retiring early and left Grant and Alina alone in the parlor. An awkward silence fell. Alina picked up her mending and Grant pretended to read a newspaper that was 3 weeks old. "Can I ask you something?" Alina's voice broke the silence. "I suppose. Did you know about the arrangement? Did you want?" She struggled for words. "I mean, was this your choice?" Grant set down the newspaper. Honesty seemed the only fair response. "No, Ma arranged it without telling me. I found out when the contract was already signed." Alina's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending. "I see, I thought perhaps, but it doesn't matter what I thought. What about you? Why did you agree to come?" She was quiet for a long moment, her needle moving through the fabric in small, precise stitches. "My father died last year. He'd made some poor investments and there were debts. My stepmother remarried quickly, and her new husband made it clear I wasn't welcome. The agency seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start. I didn't realize I was being sold to a man who didn't want me." The bitterness in those last words stung. "That's not. I don't think of it that way. How do you think of it then?" She looked up at him, and there was something fierce in her expression, a spark he hadn't seen before. "You can barely stand to be in the same room with me. You won't look at me at meals. You avoid me every chance you get. And in 2 days, I'm supposed to promise to love and honor you for the rest of my life. How exactly should I think of it?" Grant felt heat rise in his face. She was right, and her directness caught him off guard. "I was married before. My wife died. I swore I wouldn't marry again, and then Ma went behind my back and arranged this. I've been angry about it. With me. It wasn't a question. No, yes, I don't know." He stood, pacing to the window. Rain streaked the glass, obscuring the view. It's not your fault, I know that. But every time I look at you, I think about how I'm being forced into this, how I don't have a choice. Neither of us has a choice. Alina set down her mending, folding her hands in her lap. We're both trapped by circumstances, but Grant, we can choose how we handle it. We can choose to make the best of the situation, or we can spend the rest of our lives resenting each other. I know which one I'd prefer. He turned to look at her. She sat straight-backed in the lamplight, her chin raised, and he saw steel beneath the soft exterior. This was no delicate Eastern flower waiting to be crushed by harsh Western realities. This was a woman who'd lost her father, her home, everything familiar, and had the courage to travel across the country to an uncertain future. She had more strength than he'd given her credit for. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're right. None of this is your fault, and I've been treating you poorly. You deserve better." "I don't need better, I just need something. Some indication that this marriage might be more than a business arrangement. That you might, someday, be able to see me as more than an obligation your mother forced on you." Grant crossed the room, pulling a chair close to hers and sitting down. This close, he could see the flecks of blue in her gray eyes, the freckles across her nose that her powder couldn't quite hide. "I'll try. That's all I can promise right now, but I'll try." Alina smiled, a small, tentative expression that made something in his chest tighten. "That's enough. That's a start." They talked late into the night, really talked for the first time. Alina told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, her love of books and music, the small school where she taught. Grant found himself telling her about the ranch, about growing up in Colorado territory, about Sarah, and how she died. It hurt to talk about, but Alina listened without judgment, her eyes soft with sympathy. When they finally parted to go to their separate rooms, Grant caught her hand. "Tomorrow, rain or not, I'll give you that riding lesson I promised. I'll hold you to it." She squeezed his hand gently before letting go and climbing the stairs. Friday dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the air clean. True to his word, Grant saddled Daisy after breakfast and led her to the corral. Alina appeared wearing a split skirt Martha had modified for her, practical riding attire that replaced her usual impractical dresses. "Ready?" Grant asked, and Alina nodded, nerves and excitement mingling in her expression. He taught her to mount, standing close to steady her, his hands at her waist as she settled into the saddle. "Good. Now hold the reins like this." He demonstrated, then walked Daisy slowly around the corral, one hand on the mare's bridle. Alina was tense at first, gripping the reins too tightly, her back rigid. But gradually, as Daisy plodded peacefully in circles, she began to relax. Grant watched the transformation, saw the moment she stopped being afraid and started enjoying the experience. A smile spread across her face, genuine and unguarded. "This is wonderful," she called down to him. "You're a natural." He meant it. She had good balance, and she was learning to move with the horse instead of against it. "Want to try holding the reins yourself?" He spent another hour teaching her the basics of guiding the horse, how to signal turns and stops. By the end of the lesson, Alina was glowing with accomplishment, her hair coming loose from its pins, her cheeks pink from the sun and wind. "Thank you," she said as he helped her dismount, his hands again at her waist steadying her. "That was the best thing that's happened since I arrived. We can do it again. After tomorrow, I mean. I could teach you to really ride, take you out on the range. I'd like that very much." They stood close together in the corral, and for a moment, Grant thought about kissing her. The impulse caught him by surprise, both the urge itself and the realization that he wanted to. But Alina was looking up at him with such open trust that he couldn't bring himself to complicate things. Instead, he stepped back, breaking the moment. I should get back to work, but Alina, I'm glad you're here. I should have said that before, but I'm saying it now. Her smile was worth every bit of his struggle toward acceptance. I'm glad I'm here too. Saturday arrived too quickly and not quickly enough. Alina woke before dawn, her stomach churning with nerves. Martha helped her dress in the one fine dress she'd brought from Philadelphia, a simple gown of pale blue silk that Martha grudgingly admitted looked lovely. Alina pinned up her hair with her mother's combs, the only jewelry she owned. The ceremony would be at the small church in Empire City, with just a handful of guests, Pete and a few other ranch hands, Martha, the Reverend, and his wife. Alina had no one of her own to stand with her, no family to give her away. She tried not to think about what her father would have said about this marriage, this life so different from what he'd imagined for her. Grant waited at the church, dressed in his Sunday best, his hair freshly cut, his jaw cleanly shaven. Pete stood beside him, offering quiet reassurance. "You all right?" Pete asked. "No idea." Grant's hands were sweating. He'd done this before, stood at an altar and made promises. But that had been different. That had been Sarah, whom he'd loved since they were children. This was Alina, a stranger his mother had chosen, a woman he was just beginning to know. A woman who, against his will and better judgment, he was starting to care about. The church door opened, and Martha entered, followed by Alina. Grant's breath caught. She looked beautiful, the blue of her dress matching her eyes, which seemed to hold more blue than gray in the morning light streaming through the windows. She walked toward him alone, her head high, her expression calm despite what he suspected were nerves. When she reached his side, he offered his arm and she took it. Her hand trembled slightly against his sleeve. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "Thank you." Her voice was barely audible. "You look very handsome." Reverend Thomas began the ceremony, the familiar words washing over them. Grant made his responses automatically, his attention focused on Alina, on the way she carefully repeated her vows, her voice growing stronger with each phrase. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Grant lifted her veil, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. He kissed her gently, briefly, a seal on the promises they'd just made. Her lips were soft, and she tasted faintly of mint. When he pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, but she was smiling. The reception at the ranch was a simple affair. Martha had prepared a feast, and neighbors who Alina hadn't met came to congratulate them and assess the new Mrs. Jackson. Alina handled it all with grace, accepting congratulations and answering questions, though Grant could see the strain around her eyes by late afternoon. Finally, as the sun began to set, the last of the guests departed. Martha retired to her room, pointedly giving the newlyweds privacy. Grant and Alina stood in the parlor, suddenly awkward with each other. "I suppose I should move my things," Alina said, not meeting his eyes. "I'll help you." Grant followed her upstairs to what had been the guest room. Her belongings didn't take long to pack. A few dresses, some books, her mother's combs. Together they carried everything to the master bedroom at the end of the hall, Grant's room, now their room. It was larger than the guest room, with a big bed covered in a quilt Sarah had made, a washstand, a dresser, and 2 windows that looked out over the valley. Grant suddenly saw it through Alina's eyes, the sparse masculine space that held no hint of femininity. "You can change anything you like," he said quickly. "I mean, it's your room now too, put up curtains or whatever you want. It's fine." Alina set her carpetbag down, running her hand over the quilt. "This is beautiful work. Sarah made it, my first wife." The words felt like a betrayal to both women, mentioning Sarah to Alina on their wedding night. She was talented. Alina's voice held no jealousy, only appreciation. "You must miss her very much." "I did. I do." Grant sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted, but it's been 4 years. Pete says I've been existing instead of living, and he's probably right. Alina sat beside him, careful to leave space between them. We don't have to. I mean, if you need time, I understand. This is your room, your space. I don't want to intrude. Grant looked at her, this woman who was now his wife, who'd shown nothing but patience and courage since arriving in Colorado. You're not intruding. You're my wife now, Alina. That means something, even if we're still figuring out what exactly. Does it mean we share this bed? Her directness caught him off guard again. You want to? She considered the question seriously. I think so. We're married. We might as well start learning to be comfortable with each other, unless you'd rather I take the guest room. No. The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended. No, I want you here. I just don't want you to feel obligated to anything you're not ready for. Understanding dawned in her eyes. That's thoughtful of you. So we'll take things slowly. Share the bed, but nothing more until we're both ready. Yeah, that sounds good. They prepared for bed with careful modesty, Alina changing behind a screen while Grant turned his back, both of them acutely aware of the other's presence. When they finally lay down, one on each side of the big bed with a careful gap between them, the awkwardness was almost painful. Grant. Alina's voice came through the darkness. Yes, thank you for trying, for giving this a chance. I know it's not what you wanted, but I appreciate your effort. He reached across the space between them, finding her hand and holding it gently. Thank you for being patient with me. For understanding. I know I haven't made this easy. They fell asleep like that, hands linked across the expanse of bed, a tentative connection in the darkness. The next few weeks settled into a routine. Alina took over more of the household duties, learning from Martha and gradually proving herself capable. She cooked breakfast before dawn, packed lunches for the men, tended the garden, preserved vegetables for winter, cleaned and mended and managed the endless tasks of running a ranch household. Grant taught her to ride properly, taking her out on short trips around the ranch. She proved to be a quick learner, her initial fear of horses transforming into genuine affection. On Sunday afternoons, they'd ride up to the ridge overlooking the valley, and Grant would point out landmarks, tell her stories about the land, the ranch, his childhood. In the evenings, they'd sit together in the parlor, Alina reading aloud while Grant worked on tack or whittled. She had a lovely voice, expressive and clear, and Grant found himself looking forward to these quiet hours, the comfortable domesticity of it. At night, they shared the bed, gradually moving closer together as the weeks passed. Grant would wake sometimes to find Alina curled against his side, seeking warmth in the cooling autumn nights. He'd wrap an arm around her carefully, feeling protective and tender in equal measure. But there was still a distance between them, a carefulness. They were learning each other, discovering preferences and habits, but Grant held part of himself back. He couldn't help comparing Alina to Sarah, noting the ways they were different. Sarah had been born to ranch life, comfortable with animals and hard work from childhood. Alina was learning, adapting, but it wasn't natural to her the way it had been to Sarah. Alina felt the comparison even when Grant didn't voice it. She saw the way his expression would go distant sometimes, knew he was thinking about his first wife. She tried not to feel jealous of a dead woman, but it was hard, knowing she was living in Sarah's house, sleeping in Sarah's bed, married to Sarah's husband. In late October, a cold snap hit early, bringing snow that froze the ground hard. One of the mares got caught in a fence, tearing her leg badly. Grant worked for hours trying to save her, but the injury was too severe. He had to put her down, and he came back to the house just after dark, his face set in grim lines. Alina was in the kitchen, putting away the supper dishes. Martha had already gone to bed. Grant walked past her without a word, heading for the parlor and the whiskey bottle he kept in the cabinet. She followed him, watching as he poured a generous measure and drank it in one swallow. "I'm sorry about the mare. She was one of the first horses I ever trained. Sarah helped me gentle her." His voice was rough with grief and whiskey. "Everything I touch, everyone I care about, they leave or die. That's not true." Alina approached him carefully as she would a skittish horse. "It was an accident. These things happen on a ranch. Sarah was an accident too. She didn't have to die from that fever. If I'd gotten the doctor sooner, if I'd noticed she was sick earlier, she might have lived." He poured another measure of whiskey. "And now I'm supposed to what? Forget her? Replace her with you?" The word stung, but Alina could see the pain beneath the anger. "I'm not trying to replace her. I know I can't. But Grant, you have to let yourself live again. She wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life mourning her. Don't tell me what she would want. You didn't know her." "You're right. I didn't. But I know what it's like to lose someone you love. I lost my mother when I was 12, and I lost my father last year. I know grief. And I know that the only way through it is to keep living, keep opening your heart even though it hurts." Grant slammed the glass down on the cabinet. "I didn't ask for you. I didn't want a new wife. Ma forced this on me, and I've really been trying, but I can't just forget Sarah and fall in love with you because it's convenient. I never asked you to fall in love with me." Alina's voice was steady despite the tears threatening. "I just asked you to try to build something with me, but if you're going to spend our whole marriage comparing me to a ghost, then maybe this was a mistake." She turned to leave, but Grant caught her arm. "Wait. Alina, wait. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said those things." "Which part? That you were forced to marry me or that you can't love me?" She pulled her arm free, facing him. "I've been patient, Grant. I've tried to be understanding, but I can't compete with Sarah's memory. I can't be her, and I'm tired of feeling like a disappointment because I'm not." "You're not a disappointment." He reached for her again, but she stepped back. "Then what am I? We've been married almost 2 months and we're barely more than strangers. We share a bed, but you never touch me beyond holding my hand. We talk, but you never tell me anything real. I feel like I'm living with a ghost myself, haunting a life that was meant for someone else." The truth in her words cut deep. Grant stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time how his grief and resentment had hurt her. She'd left everything familiar, traveled across the country, worked herself to exhaustion trying to fit into a life that wasn't meant for her, and he'd given her nothing but half-hearted effort and constant comparison to a woman she could never be. "You're right." He sat down heavily on the sofa. "You're absolutely right. I've been a terrible husband." Alina sat beside him, not touching but close. "I don't need you to be a perfect husband. I just need you to be present. To see me, Alina, not Sarah's replacement. To be willing to build something new instead of trying to recreate what you had. I don't know how." His voice broke. "I loved her so much, and when she died, I thought I'd die too. The only way I survived was by shutting everything down, not letting myself feel. And then you came, and Ma expected me to just open up again like nothing had happened, like I hadn't spent 4 years building walls around my heart. I'm not asking you to love me." Alina took his hand, holding it gently. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But I am asking you to let those walls down enough to give us a real chance. To stop comparing me to Sarah and just see who I am." Grant looked at their joined hands, Alina's smaller and paler, but stronger than they'd been when she arrived, calloused from work. She'd changed in the past 2 months, grown tougher, more confident. She'd adapted to ranch life with determination and grace, and he'd barely noticed because he'd been too busy mourning the past. "I do see you," he said quietly. "Maybe for the first time I really see you, and I'm sorry, Alina." Sorry for taking you for granted, for being so caught up in my own grief that I didn't think about what this has been like for you. So what do we do now? We start over. Really start over. I'll try to let go of the past, and you'll keep being patient with me while I figure out how. I can do that. She leaned against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that made his chest tighten. But Grant, you have to talk to me. When you're struggling, when you're missing Sarah, tell me. Don't shut me out. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. I promise. No more shutting you out. They sat like that for a long time, the fire burning low, the house quiet around them. When they finally went upstairs, they lay down facing each other instead of backs carefully turned. Grant traced the line of Alina's cheek with his finger, learning the contours of her face in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. You're beautiful, he said, and meant it without comparison to anyone else. I should have told you that before. Alina smiled, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. You're not so bad yourself, cowboy. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but she didn't. She met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was nothing like the brief peck at their wedding. This was deeper searching, a tentative exploration of new territory. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing harder. That was nice, Alina whispered. Yeah. Grant pulled her closer, tucking her head under his chin. Yeah, it was. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, a new beginning in the darkness. After that night, things changed between them. Grant made a conscious effort to be more present, to share his day with Alina, to ask about hers. He complimented her cooking, praised her riding, noticed when she'd mended his favorite shirt. Small things, but they mattered. Alina bloomed under the attention, becoming more confident in her role as ranch wife. She started suggesting improvements to the household management, and Grant listened, implementing her ideas. She was smart, he realized, with a mind for organization that complemented his instincts about ranching. Martha watched the shift in their relationship with satisfaction. She'd known what she was doing when she'd chosen Alina Wilson. The girl had steel beneath that soft exterior, and Grant had needed someone strong enough to pull him out of his grief. She'd been right, though it had taken longer than she'd hoped for them to find their way to each other. November brought harder cold and heavier snow. The ranch work intensified as they prepared for winter, bringing cattle down from higher pastures, laying in supplies, making sure everything was secure before the worst storms hit. Alina learned to help with feeding livestock, to break ice on water troughs, to handle the 100 small tasks that kept the ranch running. One afternoon, as they were coming back from checking on the cattle in the near pasture, they found themselves caught in a sudden snowstorm. The wind picked up without warning, driving snow so thick they could barely see. Grant pulled Alina close, shouting to be heard over the wind. There's a line shack about a quarter-mile east. We need to get there before we lose visibility completely. They pushed through the storm, Grant guiding them by instinct and experience, Alina trusting him completely. By the time they reached the small cabin, both were coated in snow, fingers numb from cold. Grant got the door open and they stumbled inside. The line shack was basic, just one room with a potbelly stove, a narrow bed, and shelves holding emergency supplies. Grant got a fire going while Alina shook snow from their coats and hung them to dry. The storm raged outside, wind howling around the cabin walls. We'll have to wait it out, Grant said, holding his hands toward the stove. These sudden storms usually blow through in a few hours, but we can't risk trying to get back in this. I trust you. Alina stood beside him, and he wrapped an arm around her, sharing warmth. As the cabin heated up, they settled on the bed, the only place to sit besides the floor. They sat close together, shoulders touching, watching the fire through the stove's small window. "Tell me about Sarah," Alina said suddenly. Grant stiffened. "Why?" "Because she was part of your life and I want to understand. I'm not afraid of her memory anymore, Grant. I'm not trying to erase her. But if we're going to move forward, I need to know about your past." He was quiet for a long moment, then began to talk. He told Alina about growing up with Sarah on the neighboring ranch, about how they'd been friends as children and fallen in love as teenagers. About their wedding, so different from his and Alina's, full of joy and celebration. About the brief, happy 18 months of their marriage before the fever had swept through the valley, taking Sarah and 2 other young women. "I wasn't ready to lose her," Grant said, his voice rough with old pain. "I thought we'd have a lifetime, kids, grandkids, growing old together. When she died, it felt like my future died with her." Alina took his hand. "I understand. That's how I felt when my father died, like the future I'd imagined was just gone and I had to build a new one from nothing. Is that how you ended up here? Partly. But also, I wanted an adventure. I wanted to be more than just a teacher in a girls' school, living with my stepmother, becoming one of those dried-up spinsters everyone pities. Coming west was scary, but it was also exciting. A chance to become someone new." "And are you someone new?" Alina considered the question. "I think I'm becoming who I was always meant to be, stronger, more capable, the kind of woman who can survive in the West." She looked at him. "The kind of woman who might deserve a cowboy like you. You always deserved me, Alina. If anything, I'm not sure I deserve you. You've been nothing but patient and kind, and I've been difficult. We've both been difficult in our own ways, but we're learning." She leaned her head on his shoulder, "And I think we're getting better at it." The storm continued outside, but inside the cabin, warmth was growing that had nothing to do with the fire. Grant tilted Alina's face up to his, kissing her with more confidence than before. She responded eagerly, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, and when they finally broke apart, both were flushed and breathing hard. "Alina," Grant's voice was rough. "Are you sure? I'm your wife," she whispered, "and I want this. I want you." They came together with tenderness and growing passion, learning each other in the flickering firelight. Grant was gentle, careful, aware this was new territory for Alina despite their marriage. She was nervous but willing, trusting him completely. When they finally lay together afterward, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the blankets, both felt something had fundamentally shifted between them. "I love you," Grant said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. But they were true. Somewhere between teaching her to ride and sitting in the parlor listening to her read, between sharing a bed and sharing their lives, he'd fallen in love with his wife. Alina's smile was brilliant. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks, but I was afraid to say it." "Why?" "Because I thought you'd never feel the same way, that you'd always love Sarah and only tolerate me. I'll always have a place in my heart for Sarah. She was my first love, and that doesn't just disappear. But Alina, you're my present and my future. You're the one I choose to love now. Not because Ma arranged it, not because I have to, but because I want to." They stayed in the cabin until the storm passed, then rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon sun that made the fresh snow sparkle like diamonds. Martha took one look at them when they arrived and smiled knowingly. "Supper will be ready in an hour," was all she said, but her satisfaction was evident. That night, and every night after, Grant and Alina came together not out of obligation but desire and growing love. They talked late into the night, sharing dreams and fears, learning each other's stories. Grant told her about his father, who died when Grant was 18, leaving him to run the ranch. Alina shared her memories of her mother, the pain of losing her father, her uncertain future in Philadelphia before the agency had offered a lifeline west. Winter deepened, and the ranch settled into the quiet rhythm of cold months. There was still work to do, animals to tend, but the pace was slower, the days shorter. Grant and Alina spent more time together, and their connection deepened with every shared moment. In late December, they rode into Empire City for the Christmas social at the church. It was Alina's first real social event as Grant's wife, and she was nervous about facing the community. But Grant held her hand as they entered, making it clear to everyone that he was proud to have her as his wife. The evening was a success. Alina charmed the other ranch wives with her genuine interest in learning about their lives, and Grant found himself relaxing, enjoying the socializing in a way he hadn't since before Sarah died. When they danced, Alina light in his arms despite her limited experience, he felt a contentment he'd thought lost forever. "You're happy," Martha observed, catching him watching Alina talk with the Reverend's wife. "I am," Grant admitted. "You were right, Ma. I'm sorry I fought you on this. You needed to come to it in your own time. I just gave you a push in the right direction." Martha smiled. "She's good for you, that girl, and you're good for her. She's blossomed out here. I know. I'm a lucky man." As the new year of 1883 arrived, Grant and Alina stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching fireworks someone was setting off in town, visible as distant sparks against the dark sky. Alina leaned back against Grant's chest, his arms wrapped around her waist. "What do you wish for the new year?" she asked. "More of this, more of us." He kissed the top of her head. "What about you? The same, though." She hesitated, then continued, "I'd like to start a small school here for the ranch children and neighbors. Nothing fancy, just basic reading and arithmetic. There are so many children in the area with no access to education." "That's a wonderful idea." Grant turned her to face him. "We could fix up the old bunkhouse, the one we're not using, make it into a schoolroom. Really? You'd support that?" "Alina, I'll support anything that makes you happy. Besides, it's a good idea. Education matters," he smiled. "Though I have to admit I like the idea of you teaching. It's part of who you are, and I don't want ranch life to take that away." She kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. "Thank you, for understanding, for seeing me. Always." The winter passed, and spring arrived with a rush of melt water and new growth. The ranch work intensified again, but Alina continued to manage the household with growing confidence. She also began planning her school, working with Grant to convert the old bunkhouse, gathering primers and slates, spreading word through the community. In April, she realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week to be sure, then told Grant one evening as they prepared for bed, "I think I'm pregnant." Grant froze, his shirt halfway unbuttoned. "You're sure?" "Not completely, but the signs are there. I'd need to see a doctor to confirm, but Grant, I think we're going to have a baby." He crossed to her in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. "A baby, our baby." His voice was thick with emotion. "Are you happy about it?" "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But yes, I'm happy." "Are you?" "I'm ecstatic, and terrified too." He pulled back to look at her face. "You're going to be a wonderful mother." The doctor confirmed the pregnancy 2 weeks later. Alina was due in late November, healthy and strong, though the doctor cautioned her about overwork. Grant became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy lifting or strenuous activity. Alina had to firmly remind him she was pregnant, not fragile. "I'm still going to teach," she insisted when he suggested postponing the school. "I'll be careful, but I'm not spending the next 6 months sitting in a chair doing nothing." The school opened in May, with 8 students ranging from age 6 to 14. Alina threw herself into teaching, rediscovering her passion for education. The students loved her, and their parents appreciated the opportunity for their children to learn. Grant would sometimes stop by during the day, watching through the window as Alina led a lesson, and his heart would swell with pride and love. Summer brought long days of hard work. Alina's pregnancy began to show, a small bump that gradually grew more prominent. She adapted her dresses, continued teaching, helped with household tasks, and generally refused to be treated like an invalid despite Grant's hovering concern. In August, Martha pulled Alina aside one afternoon. "I want to say something, and I want you to really hear it, all right?" Alina set down the beans she'd been snapping. "When I chose you for Grant, I did it because I saw strength in you, steel beneath the polish. I knew my son needed someone who could pull him out of his grief, who wouldn't accept his wallowing. But Alina, you've become more than I hoped for. You've made Grant happy again, given him a future to look forward to. You've made this house a home, and I'm grateful to you." Alina felt tears prick her eyes. Martha wasn't a demonstrative woman, and this was as close to affection as she'd ever shown. "Thank you, Martha. That means more than you know. I'm also saying this because I want you to know, you're not Sarah's replacement. You're your own person, and you've earned your place here on your own merits. Whatever happens with this baby, whether it's a boy or girl, healthy or not, you'll always be my daughter now." The words were a benediction, a final acceptance. Alina hugged Martha, feeling the older woman stiffen in surprise before awkwardly patting her back. As fall arrived, Alina closed the school temporarily, her pregnancy now too advanced for her to comfortably manage a classroom of energetic students. She promised the children she'd reopen after the baby came, and they made her promise in return to let them meet the new arrival. In November, as the first snows began to fall, Alina went into labor. It was long and difficult, and Grant paced the hallway outside their bedroom where Martha and the doctor attended Alina. He'd never felt so helpless, hearing her cries of pain and unable to do anything to ease her suffering. Finally, after nearly 20 hours, a baby's cry pierced the air. The doctor emerged, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Jackson, a big, healthy boy, and your wife did wonderfully. She's tired but well." Grant rushed into the room. Alina lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle, red-faced and squalling. "Meet your son," she said softly. Grant sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the baby. He had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were dark too. Grant reached out with one finger, and the baby's tiny hand wrapped around it with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Grant whispered. "You're perfect. I love you so much, Alina. I love you too." She leaned against him, both of them gazing at their son. "What should we name him?" They discussed names but never settled on one. Grant thought about it now, looking at this new life they'd created. "What about Thomas, after your father? Thomas James Jackson." Alina's eyes filled with tears. "You do that. Name him after my father, of course. Your father gave me you in a way. Without him, you wouldn't exist, and I can't imagine my life without you now." "Thomas James Jackson," Alina repeated, smiling down at the baby. "Welcome to the world, Tommy." Tommy was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's dark coloring and his mother's gray eyes. Grant was a devoted father, getting up for nighttime feedings even though Alina was nursing, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just holding his son and marveling at the miracle of him. Alina recovered quickly from childbirth, resuming her household duties within a few weeks, though Grant tried to convince her to rest more. By January, she was talking about reopening the school, perhaps with Martha's help, so she could manage both teaching and mothering. One evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Tommy asleep in a cradle Grant had carved, Alina reading while Grant worked on a new bridle, Grant set down his work and looked at his wife. "I want to tell you something." She looked up. "What is it?" "A year ago, I couldn't imagine being happy again. I thought my life was effectively over, that I'd just be going through the motions until I died. And then you came, and I resented you for it, resented Ma for forcing the issue. But Alina, you saved my life. You pulled me back into the world of the living. You gave me a reason to care about the future again. And now we have Tommy, and I look at him and think about all the things we'll teach him, all the ways we'll watch him grow. I'm so grateful. For you, for him, for this life we're building together." Alina set down her book, her eyes bright with tears. "Grant, you saved me too. I had nothing when I came here. No home, no family, no prospects. I was desperate and scared and trying to be brave. But you gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You chose to love me even though you didn't have to, even though it was hard. That's the greatest gift anyone's ever given me." "I didn't really have a choice," Grant smiled. "You're pretty irresistible, Alina Jackson," she laughed, moving to sit beside him on the sofa. "So we saved each other." "I guess we did." He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Best thing my mother ever did, choosing you. Best thing I ever did, agreeing to come west." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the firelight flicker, listening to their son's soft breathing. Outside, snow fell steadily, blanketing the ranch in white. But inside, there was warmth and love and the sense of a future full of possibilities. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. Alina reopened her school with Martha's help, teaching a growing number of students while managing her household and raising Tommy. Grant expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land, improving the herd, building their legacy. 2 years after Tommy's birth, Alina had twin girls, Grace and Georgia, who kept the household in delightful chaos. Grant built additions to the house to accommodate their growing family. Martha mellowed with age and grandchildren, becoming a doting grandmother who spoiled the children shamelessly. When Tommy was 5, he started begging to learn to ride. Grant taught him on Daisy, the same gentle mare who taught Alina, and watching his son in the saddle brought Grant a joy he'd never imagined. Alina captured the moment in her memory, her 2 favorite people working together, Grant's patience and Tommy's determination so similar it made her smile. The school continued to thrive, becoming a permanent fixture in the community. Alina was known throughout the valley as an excellent teacher, and families would travel significant distances to have their children study with her. Grant was immensely proud, telling anyone who'd listen about his wife's accomplishments. As the children grew, the house filled with laughter and noise, so different from the quiet, grief-stricken place it had been before Alina's arrival. Grant would sometimes stop in the middle of work and just listen, marveling at how much his life had changed. He'd thought he'd never be happy again after Sarah's death, but Alina had taught him that the heart has infinite capacity for love, that honoring the past doesn't mean refusing the future. One evening, when Tommy was 7 and the twins were 5, the family sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Tommy was reading haltingly from a primer, determined to improve his skills. The twins were playing with dolls Alina had sewn. Martha sat in her rocking chair, knitting tiny booties because Alina was pregnant again, due in the spring. Grant's arm was around Alina's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. This, he thought, was everything. This was the life he'd never dared hope for after Sarah died. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something entirely new and precious. "What are you thinking?" Alina asked quietly. "That I'm the luckiest man alive." She tilted her head to look up at him. Even though your mother chose me, especially because she chose you." He kissed her softly. "Though I like to think I would have chosen you myself if I'd had the sense." "Well, you got there eventually." Her eyes sparkled with amusement. "Only took you a couple months to figure out I was worth keeping. Best decision I ever made, choosing to love you." "Second best," she corrected. "The best decision was letting yourself be open to love in the first place. That was the brave part." They sat together as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The children's voices mixed with the sounds of evening, cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corral, the soft hoot of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. In the spring, Alina gave birth to another son, Daniel. He was smaller than Tommy had been, but just as healthy, with his mother's light brown hair and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone who met him. The house seemed to burst at the seams with 4 children, but Grant and Alina wouldn't have changed a thing. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep when Daniel was 2 years old. She'd lived to see her son happy, her grandchildren healthy, and her home filled with love. At her funeral, Grant spoke about her strength, her wisdom, and the greatest gift she'd ever given him, choosing Alina as his wife when he'd been too stubborn and grief-stricken to choose for himself. "She saw what I couldn't," Grant said, his voice breaking slightly. "She saw that Alina was exactly what I needed, what our family needed. And she was right. Ma was almost always right, even when I didn't want to admit it." After Martha's death, Grant and Alina took over the master bedroom, the largest room in the house. They redecorated together, Alina finally making it truly theirs rather than a space still haunted by Sarah's memory. She kept the quilt Sarah had made, though, storing it carefully in a chest. It was part of the house's history, part of Grant's history, and she honored that. The children grew and thrived. Tommy showed a natural talent for ranching, following his father everywhere, learning the business from the ground up. The twins were as different as 2 people could be. Grace was quiet and thoughtful, preferring books to horses, while Georgia was a wild thing who climbed trees and caught frogs and drove her mother to distraction. Daniel was the peacemaker, the one who could smooth over conflicts and make everyone laugh. Alina's school became something of an institution. She taught not just the basics, but instilled in her students a love of learning, an appreciation for literature and history, and the wider world beyond their valley. Several of her students went on to higher education, a rare achievement for frontier children, and they credited Alina's teaching and encouragement for opening those doors. Grant continued to expand the ranch, but he made sure to balance work with family time. He'd learned the hard way that life was precious and uncertain, that the people you love can be taken without warning. He never wanted his children to doubt how much he cared for them, never wanted Alina to feel neglected or taken for granted. He made it a point to tell her he loved her every single day, to kiss her good morning and good night, to hold her hand when they sat together in the evenings. "You're awfully affectionate for a tough rancher," Alina teased one night as they prepared for bed. "I've learned that life's too short to not show the people you love how you feel," he pulled her close. "Besides, you like it when I'm affectionate. Maybe." She smiled against his chest. "Just maybe." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Grant took Alina on a trip to Denver, leaving the children with Pete and his wife. It was their first time away from the ranch together since their wedding, and Alina was giddy with the novelty of it. They stayed in a hotel, attended a play at the theater, ate in restaurants, and walked the city streets hand in hand like courting youngsters. On their last night, as they stood on the hotel balcony looking at the city lights, Grant pulled a small box from his pocket. "I never gave you a proper wedding ring. We got married so fast, and I was so resistant to the whole thing, I didn't think about it. but I'm thinking about it now." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with 3 small diamonds. 10 years, 3 children, and a lifetime of love ahead of us. Will you accept this ring as a symbol of the life we've built together?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Grant, you didn't have to do this. I wanted to. You deserve to have something beautiful, something that shows the world you're loved and valued." She held out her hand, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the lamplight and sparkling. "It's beautiful, thank you." She kissed him deeply. "Though you know I don't need a ring to know I'm loved. You show me every single day, still. You deserve beautiful things." He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest as they looked out over the city. "You deserve everything good, Eleanor. I hope I can spend the rest of my life giving that to you." "You already have," she whispered. "You've given me a home, a family, a purpose. You've given me yourself. That's everything I could ever want." They returned to the ranch to find the children had missed them terribly, and the house in mild chaos. But it was a joyful chaos, the kind that comes from a family full of life and love. As they sat down to dinner that first night back, children talking over each other to share everything that had happened while their parents were gone, Grant caught Eleanor's eye across the table. She smiled at him, that special smile she reserved just for him, and he smiled back. This was his life now. Not the one he'd planned, not the one he'd thought he wanted when his mother had announced she'd chosen him a bride. But it was better than anything he could have imagined. Eleanor had brought light back into his darkness, had taught him that love wasn't a finite resource, that opening your heart again after loss wasn't a betrayal, but an affirmation of life itself. The years continued to pass, marked by birthdays and holidays, by the changing seasons and the steady rhythm of ranch life. The children grew into adolescence, and then young adulthood. Tommy took over more responsibility on the ranch, showing the same instincts and dedication as his father. Grace became a teacher herself, studying at a normal school in Denver before returning to help her mother with the Valley School. Georgia married a neighboring rancher's son and started her own family. Daniel decided he wanted to study law, heading east for school, though he promised to return to Colorado. Grant and Eleanor aged together, their love deepening with each passing year. They faced challenges, droughts that tested the ranch's resources, illnesses that scared them, the normal struggles of raising children and running a business. But they faced everything together, partners in the truest sense. On a summer evening when they'd been married 25 years, they sat together on the porch swing Grant had built. Their grandchildren played in the yard, Georgia's 3 children visiting for the week. Tommy and his wife lived in the house Martha had occupied, running the ranch alongside Grant. Grace was inside helping Eleanor prepare dinner. Daniel was expected home from law school in a few days. 25 years, Eleanor mused, her hand in Grant's. "Can you believe it? Some days no. Feels like you just arrived yesterday, stepping off that stagecoach looking scared and determined." He squeezed her hand. "Other days it feels like you've always been here, like I can't remember life without you. Any regrets? Not a single one. You, only that I didn't come sooner." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Though I suppose the timing was right, we both needed to be ready." Ma knew that. She waited until I'd grieved long enough, then forced the issue. Grant smiled. "I gave her so much grief about it, but she was absolutely right. She saw what I needed before I could see it myself." "We were lucky," Eleanor said. "So many arranged marriages don't work out." "But we found love." "We chose love," Grant corrected. "Ma chose you, but I chose to love you. Every day I make that choice. And every day it gets easier, more natural, until it's not even a choice anymore. It's just who I am, the man who loves Eleanor Jackson." She turned to kiss him, soft and sweet, the kiss of long married partners who still found joy in each other. And I'm the woman who loves Grant Jackson, the cowboy who opened his heart when he thought it was too broken to love again. They sat together as the sun set, surrounded by the life they'd built together. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous and well-run. Their children were healthy, happy, finding their own paths in the world. Their love had endured and deepened, becoming the foundation on which everything else was built. Grant thought about the young man he'd been when Alina arrived, angry and grief-stricken, convinced his life was effectively over. He'd been so wrong. Life had been waiting to begin again, if only he'd been brave enough to let it. Alina had given him that courage, had refused to accept his walls and his resistance. She'd been patient when he needed patience, firm when he needed firmness, loving when he needed love most. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For coming to Colorado. For marrying me even though I was terrible to you at first. For being patient while I figured out how to love again. For giving me our children, our life, everything." Alina smiled, her face lined now with the years but still beautiful to him. "Thank you for choosing to love me. You didn't have to. Your mother chose me, but you chose love. That made all the difference." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Grant pulled Alina closer, and she settled against him with the ease of long practice. Inside the house, they could hear their family, children laughing, Grace singing while she cooked, Tommy's voice as he told a story. This was their legacy, this love, this family, this life built from an arranged marriage that had become the greatest love story Grant could imagine. He'd thought once that he'd only get one great love in his lifetime. Sarah had been that love, or so he'd believed. But life had taught him differently. The heart's capacity for love was infinite, and choosing to love again wasn't betraying the past. It was honoring it, proving that love itself was worth the risk of loss, that opening yourself to another person was the bravest and most worthwhile thing you could do. Martha had been right to choose Alina. But Grant was proud that he'd chosen to love her, had made that choice every day for 25 years. And he'd keep making it for however many years they had left together, grateful for the gift of this second chance, this unexpected love, this life that had grown from the seed his mother planted when she'd said, "I've chosen your bride." The best decision Grant had ever made was accepting that choice and making it his own, transforming obligation into love, arrangement into partnership, and two strangers into soulmates. As the evening deepened and the family gathered for dinner, Grant held Alina's hand and silently thanked his mother, wherever as she was, for seeing what he couldn't, for knowing what he needed, for giving him Alina. The bride had been chosen by his mother. The cowboy had chosen to love her anyway. And in that choice, in that love, they'd both found everything they'd ever needed, and more than they'd ever dared to dream.